The consideration of U.S. trade policy by the Senate in the middle of May has been extremely successful and extremely positive for U.S. trade policy. The Senate is pursuing two separate tracks to deal with trade issues. The first track is to authorize Trade Promotion Authority, the procedure that would enable President Obama and his administration to complete the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the biggest and most important trade agreement in American history. The TPP would be good for the American economy. It would create jobs. It would raise incomes in the export sector. It would strengthen our competitiveness. And it would have major foreign policy benefits by linking the United States more extensively with Asia, promoting the pivot to Asia, the rebalancing of U.S. foreign policy toward the most dynamic part of the world. Senate approval of Trade Promotion Authority, now permitted by the procedural agreements that were reached in the first week of debate, will give a lot of momentum to subsequent action in the House of Representatives and push the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation toward a successful outcome. The second track, emerging from the Senate, is to deal with a series of trade enforcement issues which are necessary both to defend U.S. economic interests, but also to provide credibility for trade policy to the many skeptics who are doubtful of the merits of a new trade agreement, or indeed trade more generally. The most important and controversial part of that enforcement legislation is the currency provisions. There's been a widespread debate over whether new policies are needed to deal with currency manipulation by foreign countries, and the answer is clearly yes. Currency manipulation has been by far the biggest trade distortion, trade barrier in the world over the last decade or so. About 20 countries have been intervening extensively in the currency markets to the tune of as much as $1 trillion per year to improve their competitive positions, adversely affect U.S. competitiveness, and thereby distort trade policy. What these countries do is buy dollars with their currencies, keeping the dollar overvalued and too strong, keeping their currencies undervalued and too weak. When China was maximizing its intervention a few years ago, it was undervaluing its currency by 30 to 40%, which is the equivalent of subsidizing all your exports by 30 to 40%, putting a surcharge of 30 to 40% on all your imports, and obviously distorting trade hugely. We calculated that hurt U.S. trade by several $100 billion per year and cost the United States a couple of million jobs right at the time of the Great Recession when we could least afford it. So it's quite right for trade policy to deal with currency manipulation. The way the Senate has organized to do that is separately from the Trade Promotion Authority and the Trans-Pacific Partnership itself. It would not, at least at this point, put currency issues into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That would be resisted by other governments and would cause big problems for the negotiations. But rather, they would put it in separate parallel legislation, which would authorize the Treasury Department to take a whole series of new steps and would authorize the application of countervailing duties against exports to the United States subsidized through currency manipulation by other countries. The prospects for passing both parts of the trade legislation, I think, are quite good, quite favorable. Many of the opponents of the Trade Promotion Authority were persuaded in the Senate to vote for at least the procedural part of the deal by the concomitant agreement to move on currency manipulation. And I suspect that linkage will continue through the process, including when the legislation goes to the House of Representatives. It is quite true that the amount of currency manipulation, as I mentioned, was quite large in recent years, has recently declined considerably. China has let its currency go up a lot, its trade surplus has come down a lot, and some of the other countries are not manipulating as much. But I think that means this is the right time, indeed the best time, to put new legislation in the books to deal with the issue. There will not be as much pushback as much resistance by other countries because they would not be indicted, at least at the outset, by the legislation. But what is needed, and that should be the goal of policy, is to create effective deterrence to currency manipulation coming back and again distorting trade and costing U.S. jobs. The administration says, don't interrupt what we're doing. We've successfully gotten the Chinese to let their currency go up, reduce their surplus. That's true, but they did it 5, 6, 7 years after the problem was at its height, after many millions of jobs were lost, after hundreds of billions of dollars of production was shifted out of the United States. They locked the barn door way after the horse had left. So what we need going forward is a deterrent, which means effective policies that would be implemented if the practice comes back, and therefore deter countries from going back to the bad old ways. That, I think, is what the Senate has teed up and what the current trade policy process is likely to generate. Now, the administration has worried that acting on currency would be a, quote, poison pill for the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations themselves. So it's essential to remember that the action that's been teed up on currency is completely outside the trade negotiations, not part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and therefore could hardly be characterized as a poison pill. And so, as we reflect on what the Senate has been doing, I think we can look forward to a positive outcome, one that will deal with the huge opportunities of a new trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, deal with the worst, most egregious trade policy distortion of the past, currency manipulation, and put U.S. trade policy on a very constructive path going forward for the period ahead.